Strength gains are specific in 8 different ways, and that means that if we train in one particular way, then we increase our strength when tested in that particular way to a greater extent than when tested in other ways. And the 8 ways in which strength is specific are the muscle group that we train. Now obviously, if we train one muscle group, then we improve strength for that muscle group, and we don't tend to improve strength in other muscle groups. It's also specific to the velocity that we use. If we train with heavy weights and slow speeds, because we have to use a slow speed when we use a heavy weight, then we'll improve our strength against heavy weights. But when we try and apply that strength, that ability to produce force against light weights, to move light weights quickly, we'll find that our improvements aren't as great. Similarly, if we train with light weights and fast bar speeds and maximal efforts, then we'll improve our ability to produce force against light weights to a greater extent than we will against heavy weights. Strength is specific to the contraction mode that we use, so whether the muscle is shortening or lengthening. And obviously we can produce a lot more force while the muscle is lengthening because of the involvement of the passive parts of the fibre which stretch elastically. So if we can develop those elastic parts of the muscle fibre, such as titin or the collagen, then we'll improve our strength preferentially in that lengthening phase, and we won't tend to improve the strength in the shortening phase by quite as much. Strength is specific to the range of motion that we use because it's specific to muscle length. So if we improve strength at long muscle lengths, then that won't transfer quite as much to short muscle lengths. And conversely, if we improve strength at short muscle lengths, that won't transfer quite as much to long muscle lengths. Strength is specific to the point on the strength endurance continuum that we train. So if we train with heavy weights and for a small number of reps, then we'll improve strength against heavy weights. If we train with many reps and light weights for repeated contractions, then we'll improve our muscular endurance, which is at the endurance end of the strength endurance continuum. If we train under stable conditions, then we'll improve our strength under stable conditions to a greater extent than we will under unstable conditions. And similarly, if we train predominantly with unstable loads, such as dumbbells, or if we use dumbbells while resting on an unstable surface, such as a Swiss ball, then we'll improve our strength under those conditions to a greater extent than under stable conditions. Strength is specific to the type of external resistance we use. So if we use weight, then we'll improve our strength when lifting a weight to a greater extent than we will when using accommodating resistance, such as elastic bands or chains, for the exact same exercise. And obviously the converse is also true. And strength is specific to the force vector that we use. So if we train with a horizontal force vector, then we'll improve our ability to produce force in a horizontal direction to a greater extent than we will in a vertical direction. And conversely, if we train with a vertical force vector, then we'll improve our ability to produce force with a vertical force vector to a greater extent than we will when using a horizontal force vector. We can use the fact that strength gains are specific to the type of training that we do to optimize our strength training programs for sporting performance. So any given sporting movement will involve limiting factors that determine its performance. And these limiting factors will involve muscles producing force in a particular way. If we can identify how these muscles are producing force and which muscles they are, then we can identify how to put together a strength training program that will develop the ability of those muscles to produce force in that way. High-speed running performance is limited by our ability to produce a turning force at the hip and also at the knee. At the hip, we have to produce a hip flexion turning force at the beginning of the swing phase and a hip extension turning force at the end of the swing phase. At the knee, we have to produce a knee extension turning force at the beginning of the swing phase and a knee flexion turning force at the end of the swing phase. And all of those turning forces are very closely linked to our ability to increase running speed. So the faster we go, the larger those turning forces become. In contrast, the turning forces of those joints in the stance phase while our feet are on the ground doesn't tend to change by quite as much. So this tells us that we have to focus on the ability to produce turning forces at the hip and the knee in the swing phase under those specific conditions in which the joints are producing peak forces to a greater extent than we have to focus on what's happening while the feet are on the ground. So what can we say about these specific turning forces that will enable us to develop our ability to produce them to a greater extent? Well, if we look at the hip, then the hip flexors have to produce force at the beginning of the swing phase, predominantly, while they're fairly long, and they have to produce that force while they're shortening, and while they're shortening to high velocity. So we have several key factors there that will help us understand how to develop that ability to produce a turning force with the hip at the beginning of the swing phase. And similarly, if we look at the end of the swing phase, the hip extensors have to produce a force while they're reasonably short and while they're moving very quickly, and also again while they're shortening. So the key factors for both of these muscle groups are that they have to produce force very quickly and they have to produce force while they're shortening. And the differences are that the hip flexors tend to have to produce peak forces while they're reasonably long, and the hip extensors have to produce force while they're very short. At the knee extensors are producing a turning force while the knee is flexing at the beginning of the swing phase, so therefore the muscles are lengthening, and they're lengthening at a fairly high speed, and they're doing that from a short to a moderately long muscle length. At the end of the swing phase, the knee flexors are producing a knee flexion turning force while the knee is extending, therefore they're also lengthening, and they're doing that at a moderate muscle length because the hamstrings have a very wide range of functional lengths because they're two joint muscles, and they're obviously doing that at a high speed. And together we can see that the main characteristic of the knee muscles during high speed running is to produce force while they're lengthening, and they're doing that at a fairly moderate range of muscle lengths, and they're obviously doing that at very high speeds. Practically speaking, this means that if we want to find exercises that transfer really well to high-speed running performance, then we want exercises that develop the ability of the hip flexors and hip extensors to produce high-velocity forces while they're shortening, and we want to find exercises that improve the ability of the knee extensors and flexors to produce high-velocity forces while they're lengthening. And we also want to look at the muscle lengths that each of the muscles are producing peak forces at. So in the case of the hip extensors, we want to focus on short muscle lengths. In the case of the hip flexors, we want to focus on longer muscle lengths. And in the case of the knee extensors and the knee flexors, we want to look at moderate to moderately long muscle lengths. So for the hip extensors, we might consider the jump squat or the kettlebell swing to be very good exercises. The kettlebell swing has the additional benefit of involving a horizontal force vector, which is possibly an extra feature that could be valuable from a specific strength framework. And for the hip flexors, we might want to look at exercises that involve weighted hip flexion with fairly light weights, such as using wearable resistance, or we might compromise and use accommodating resistance, such as elastic bands, because hip flexion is quite a difficult movement to load in the gym, and so we have to be somewhat creative to produce an exercise that fits our requirements. At the knee extensors and the knee flexors both require fairly high velocity forces while they are lengthening, so we might look at Nordic curls and reverse Nordics, or we might look at knee extensions and leg curls with eccentric overload if we have that equipment available. It's worth bearing in mind that although the ability to produce force while muscles are lengthening is less velocity specific than the ability to produce force while muscles are shortening, it is still somewhat velocity specific, because as we produce forces with high velocities while muscles are lengthening, that involves the elastic elements a lot more and the contractile elements a lot less. So if we want to develop the ability to produce high velocity forces while muscles are lengthening, then we do need to try and train that to a degree. And that will involve training those particular exercises by increasing load over time rather than by increasing the duration of the rep over time. So it's quite common for us to progress a Nordic curl by taking longer to lower ourselves under control. But if we're trying to train specifically for improving high-speed running performance, then we would probably want to try and progress the exercise by adding weight in the form of a weighted vest once we reached a certain speed of movement. Ultimately, though, it's not about saying these are the right exercises to use for a sprinting or a high-speed running training program. It's about saying this is the framework through which we make the decisions about what exercises to include. And the framework will change over time as we learn more about the ways in which strength is specific and as we learn more about the determinants of high-speed running performance.